In this segment, I'm going to talk about the ventricular pressure volume loop and the cardiac cycle. Before discussing the ventricular pressure volume loop, it's important to go back and look at the Frankstarling relationship. On the upper curve, along here, this is the Frankstarling relationship. I'm looking at the initial myocardial fiber length on the x-axis and the ventricular end diastolic volume, either one. I prefer to use end diastolic volume, as you'll see when we do the pressure volume loop. On this axis, I'm looking at either stroke volume or peak ventricular pressure. And again, I will prefer to use peak ventricular pressure rather than stroke volume. This upper curve shows the relationship between peak ventricular pressure and end diastolic volume. As the end diastolic volume increases, the peak ventricular pressure also increases. And this is primarily due to changes in sensitivity to calcium and in calcium channel open probability. The lower curve represents the diastolic pressure volume curve. That is, as the ventricles are stretched because of increased ventricular volume, it becomes more and more difficult to continue stretching it. The elastic recoil is causing an increase in the pressure. That's all I'm going to discuss on the Frankstarling relationship. At this point, I'm going to switch to the models that I have created for this segment. Let's begin by building the pressure volume loop from scratch. Beginning, we see the mitral valve opening. We can see an increase in left ventricular volume moving along this direction, followed by a slight blip, which is the atria just contracting, until we reach this point at the end here. Now, the next thing that happens is the mitral valves have just closed, and the ventricles have begun to contract. The contraction of the ventricles pushes blood up against the mitral valves and then closes them. However, the blood cannot leave the heart until the aortic valve opens, and the aortic valve won't open until the pressure rises above approximately 80 millimeters of mercury, which is the aortic diastolic pressure. So we call this isovolumetric contraction. No change in volume increases in pressure until we reach a point just above the aortic diastolic pressure. At this point, the pressure in the ventricles will push the aortic valve open, and now we see an ejection of blood along this curve here. And the peak pressure reached in the ventricles, in this case, is about 120 millimeters of mercury, the aortic systolic pressure. Now we begin to see the pressure fall off as the ventricle loses its ability to continue contracting. At this next point, the aortic valve has just closed and the ventricles are beginning to relax. During this phase, the blood cannot enter the heart from the aorta because the aortic valves have been pushed closed, and the mitral valves cannot open yet because the atrial pressure is still fairly low. Finally, we reach this point back here again where the mitral valves will open and the filling will continue, and it'll continue and go around in this fashion. Now, the stroke volume is the difference between end diastolic volume, the blood in the heart just before contraction begins, and the blood left in the heart, the end systolic volume, sometimes called residual volume. The difference between those two is the stroke volume, in this case 79 milliliters. So let me go back to the beginning, and we'll add in the cardiac cycle figure, which is pressure or volume as a function of time. This is the standard figure you see in most books. So starting again, mitral valve is opened, increase in volume, we're looking at that in the green curve here, slight increase again with the atrial contraction, relatively little change in pressure. During isovolumetric contraction, no change in volume, pressure's rising. The mitral valve has just closed. At this phase, the aortic valve is opened. We see a reduction in ventricular volume, increase in ventricular pressure to its peak, pressure begins to fall. Finally, isovolumetric relaxation. Pressure is falling and there's no change in volume. And once again, we can see now the stroke volume, the difference between end diastolic volume and end systolic volume. So now I'm going to move on to the effect of changes in cardiac performance on the pressure volume loop. Here we're looking at the pressure volume loop with the left ventricular volume along the horizontal axis and left ventricular pressure along the vertical axis. And what I can do is change three variables here: preload, afterload, and contractility. Increasing preload is, as we see here, causes an increase in the amount of blood entering the left ventricle. So here we went from about 147 milliliters to maybe 162 milliliters of blood in the heart. This increase in ventricular filling is the result of an increase in venous pressure, which is driving the blood into the heart. And pressure is related to volume, so an increase in venous volume, venous blood volume, would cause an increase in venous pressure and therefore an increase in preload. Notice that the increase in preload, which brought our end diastolic volume to 160 plus, notice that the increase in the left ventricular volume led to an increase in contractility, thereby ejecting all of the blood that it would have plus this increase in blood that entered the heart. This is the direct result of the Frankstarling relationship. Stretch the heart, you cause an increase in contractility, and that causes an increase in the ejection of blood from the heart. The opposite occurs if I were to decrease the preload. The less blood enters the ventricles, the ventricular contractile force decreases, and we eject less blood. Now, afterload is the force impeding blood from leaving the heart, and that is a direct result of arterial blood pressure. If arterial blood pressure rises, it's going to be harder to get the blood out of the heart into this higher pressure. So if I increase afterload, what we can see is the heart filled to the same level. It required a little more pressure to get the aortic valve to open, owing to an increase in diastolic aortic pressure. Also, because the pressure in the arteries is so high, in this case about 140 over about 95, the heart cannot eject a full amount of blood before it slows down. The pressure pushing the blood backwards toward the heart is great enough to slow down the ejection of blood. So we see now that the stroke volume here now fell to 66 milliliters. The opposite happens if we decrease afterload, decrease arterial pressure. This individual is hypotensive, but end diastolic volume hasn't changed. In this example, the heart has very little difficulty in ejecting blood against a low pressure, in this case about 100 millimeters of mercury over approximately 70. So we get a larger ejection of blood from the heart. And the last variable I want to change is the contractility. Contractility refers to the extrinsic factors affecting the heart, not to the Frankstarling relationship. That would be sympathetic nerve stimulation or drugs, including cardiac glycosides. So if I increase contractility without changing preload, we see an increase in the ejection of blood from the heart. So there's a smaller end systolic volume increase in the ejection fraction, which is the amount of blood ejected, stroke volume, divided by end diastolic volume. That gives you ejection fraction. On the other hand, if I decrease contractility, this could be a decrease in sympathetic nerves or heart failure, we could see now a decrease in the ejection fraction, higher end systolic volume. Let me take a minute to put a condition up and give you a chance to see if you can figure out what's happening here. In this example, I have a large increase in preload and a decrease in afterload. So the preload causes an increase in ventricular filling. The low afterload causes an increase in ejection fraction. So what condition could cause an increase in venous blood pressure, therefore venous volume, and a decrease in arterial blood pressure, which means arterial blood volume? Increased venous volume, decreased arterial volume. Give you a second. Well, the answer could be a decrease in total peripheral resistance, vasodilation. This could be the result of sepsis or some other effect that causes the blood to drain from the arterial side, decreasing arterial pressure, to the venous side, increasing venous pressure, giving us an increase in preload and a decrease in afterload. A decrease in cardiac output could cause the same effect. A decrease in cardiac output would leave the blood volume on the arterial side low and the blood volume on the venous side high, giving you the same effect. Let's try one other, and I'll give you a time to figure this one out. An increase in both preload and afterload. That means there's an increase in pressure on both the venous and the arterial side, indicating an increase in volume on both the venous and arterial side. What could cause an increase in volume on both sides of the arterial circulation? Okay, an increase in blood volume could lead to an increase in both venous and arterial blood pressure. So that could be because of kidney failure, it could be excessive fluid intake, could cause an increase in blood volume on both sides of the arterial circulation. Now I'm going to add the cardiac cycle that you so often see in the books these days, which shows time on the x-axis and pressure and volume on the y-axis. Now I'm looking in white at the ventricular pressure, left ventricular pressure, in green, left ventricular volume, yellow is aortic pressure, and blue is atrial pressure. So once again, let's increase the preload and see what that does. So again, on the pressure volume loop, we've increased the volume of blood entering the heart, stretching the muscles. If we look down here, we can see an increase in the end diastolic volume on the green curve. The dotted lines represent breadcrumbs, which, if you remember from your story of Hansel and Gretel, was the way to find their way home, which didn't work for them. In this case, the breadcrumbs represent the initial condition. So here we can see an increase in blood volume in the left ventricle, end diastolic volume, no change in end systolic volume, increase in the ejection volume, stroke volume, or ejection fraction of blood. And if we increase the afterload, now we see no change in end diastolic volume. And we can look here. Remember here, this is our aortic pressure, the original. Now we can see the aortic pressure is much, much higher. In this case, here was our original, the white dotted line here, original ventricular pressure. We can see now the ventricular pressure has to rise higher in order to eject the blood from the heart. An increase in end systolic volume here. And if we look at the effect of contractility, again we can see the effect on the pressure volume loop. The blue line shows that the heart pushes more blood out, increasing arterial blood volume and arterial blood pressure. Slight increase in afterload and a decrease in end systolic volume, residual volume. Down here we can see the same thing happen. No change in end diastolic volume, a decrease in end systolic volume, slight increase in the ventricular pressure and in aortic blood pressure. One point I wanted to make is that these tests that I'm showing you here are not steady state changes. These are one-time only changes. Generally, if there's an increase in preload or an increase in afterload or a change in contractility, the steady state condition is going to involve changes in blood volume as a result of kidney trying to keep blood pressure at a certain level. So in an example like this, if there is a decrease in blood volume, contractility will increase in order to bring blood pressure back up. If there is a decrease in contractility as a result of maybe heart failure, we can see an increase in both preload and afterload, which is the result of increased total blood volume, although preload will probably increase to a greater extent than afterload. But now we've got our stroke volume back and our blood pressure back to normal. So most of the examples I'm showing you do not include the steady state changes that occur between the interactions of the cardiovascular and renal function. Well, that concludes my discussion of the pressure volume loop and the cardiac cycle.